I would like to move on to Mr. Andrew Rudd. He is the Urban Environment Officer here at the New York Liaison Office of UN Habitat. Mr. Rudd, you have the floor.
Thanks very much indeed, Robert. I send my, actually the regrets of my colleagues to meet Nick Court, who is the director of our office, who was called away on urgent business negotiating a resolution, as happens at the UN. We've spoken a bit about Habitat's mandate as the UN agency that deals with urbanization and urban development. What we really do, what we try to do, is to take fresh urban data, translate that into norms, and demonstrate that it can be contextualized on the ground in different places, whether that's a plan or a pilot project. Working on the issue of persons with disabilities is fairly new for us, but we're working on it. There are a lot of statistics that highlight the importance of this nexus. In Brazil, for example, 25% of the population live with disabilities, and 85% of them live in cities. In the Dominican Republic, 75% of persons with disabilities live in cities, but at a rate of unemployment triple that of the national average. So we begin to see some of the specific needs emerge to deal with this in this context. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities goes even further, saying, amongst many other things, that everyone has the right to live independently and in a community, which is a very specific social and spatial benefit. Also says people have the right to choose their places of residence and to access services outside of their residence. Again, a very location-based right that I think we're uniquely placed to deal with. A lot of rights, some would say, don't really exist until they're concretized, until they're acted out. I don't have a Shakespeare quote myself, but I'll run up with that. But a quote from a French spatial philosopher of the late 20th century, one that Jeannie, I think, is quite fond of. And that's Henri Lefebvre, who was known to have said that social relations are really just kind of hypothetical until they're made spatial. And I think that really points to the importance of the spatial dimension in a lot of what we're doing. How does the body engage the city physically? What are people's perceptions of places really like? Do places feel crowded, safe? Are there eyes on the street? Is there enough peripheral vision to be able to navigate one's way? There's streets, sidewalks, crossings, etc. And so a lot of the work, I think, that we do at Habitat, there's a lot of work that we do in many different areas. Jeannie outlined some of those. Other priorities include legislation and finance, but planning and design is something fairly unique, I think, to what we do. And the work of planners and designers, I would say, is in some ways an act of everyday empathy, perhaps. How do others see, hear, and feel things? What's the experience like for the end user of the building, the city? And this really isn't unlike taking an experiential view of what it's like for older people, or for very young people to exist out in public space. We're designing for all these people. I'm just going to highlight two key factors, I would say, in bringing the work we do in planning and design to persons living with disabilities. One is location, and the other is choreography. First, location. In the 20th century, cities have increasingly distanced places of home, work, and services. And this often occurs in the context of increasing sprawl, where densities get lower and lower, and people live further and further away from places where there are jobs that are available. Oftentimes, public transit in these places is very, very poor, if it exists at all, because there simply isn't a critical mass to support public transit. It's an accelerating trend. It's leading to very long commutes. It's not just in the developed world. It is accelerating frighteningly in areas in the developing world where growth is highest. And this bodes very poorly indeed for persons with disabilities who in such situations can be completely isolated, living in places where they do not have access to work and other services. It's a big problem. These things have to be co-located. They've got to be close. affordable housing needs to be located near jobs, and there needs to be frequent public transit, accessible public transit connecting the two. And the second, choreography is what I'll call it. This for me is about articulating the kind of concrete and material transition between the various points of everyday life, moving through the city from the house, the front door, the semi-private space of a corridor, into the semi-public space of a lobby, which usually involves some kind of vertical or grade transition, out into the public space of the sidewalk and the street, which can be a very chaotic place, filled with many modes of transportation, not usually designed for the most vulnerable. And the wayfinding that's required to get between these various points, right? The orientation that helps people understand where they're going, and whether or not that is communicable with people who may be blind or deaf. All of these things are really important for getting around in the city. So with those two things, I feel quite confident that we can make a lot of progress in planning and design. We're starting to do this in cities like Johannesburg, in Santa Marta, in Colombia, in Nairobi, and even at the national scale, doing street redesign, safer streets in countries like Myanmar. And I'm optimistic we can do a lot better. Looking forward to hearing some more of the innovations that there's time to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rudd, and thank you for sharing with all of us UN Habitat's focus on translating urban data into norms. You spoke quite a bit about the convention, or the importance of the convention on the rights of persons with disabilities, which our office is also working on implementing on all levels. As we all know, the issues such as accessibility, education, employment, but also political participation are important aspects in the convention itself. And they're not only important for persons with disabilities, but also for other social groups in order to be fully included in the new urban agenda and to have their rightful say. I would like to turn now to our last two speakers. First, I would welcome the remarks of Mr. Saul Salinas. He is the Managing Director of Accenture Digital, and he works on mobile and global lead Accenture Smart Cities. And he will talk about the focus of his work and what his company is doing. There we go.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. We're delighted to be here with the panel, very impressive panel, and on behalf of Accenture, we're also delighted to be part of this dialogue. Let me just first say that the issue of enfranchising the disenfranchised is highly personal for me. I came to the United States. I was born in Nicaragua, and I quite literally lived in the streets until the age of 8 with my two brothers, having to struggle almost daily to find a place to eat, a place to live. And we escaped the war. For some of you who are familiar with Central American politics and history, there was a very violent revolution in Nicaragua in the 70s, and we escaped that. Unfortunately, came here and were able to partake in the benefits of being a part of the United States of America. So a highly personal issue for me. I oversee Accenture's Smart Cities practice, but I don't use the word smart, because smart is descriptive of the technologies, and the technologies have dictated the dialogue on what it means to be connected. And those of us who have been involved in the issue of the Internet of Things, the digital, have been involved in discussions that have been highly technical, frankly, sensors, gateways, routers, a cloud, etc. And for the right reasons, frankly, because the technologies have been innovative, have been exciting, they've been alluring, they've been very tempting to deploy and use. But the smartness is about the technology. So what does the technologies do for cities? I use an entirely different term. And if you hear us speak at Accenture, we use a different term. And it relates to sort of perhaps a future vision of cities, not 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out, but 50 years out. I'm a big Star Trek fan. I grew up after I came to the US with Star Trek, and Jim Kirk is my hero. And actually, as a big a fan as I was of Star Trek, I became a bigger fan of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And there's a character in Star Trek: The Next Generation called the Borg. And for those of you who are familiar with the Borg, you understand what that means. It's an entity, united, but made up of different individuals connected. A sentient being. In the instance, in Star Trek: Next Generation, that sentient being was actually a malevolent being, not a benign being. But that is exactly where we're headed in cities. Cities is where we will all live, as a number of the speakers have discussed. And it is increasingly a connected environment. And so when I talk about cities, I talk about the sentient city. Think of this, by the year 2020, which is 3 years out, there'll be 26 sensors, occupancy sensors, light sensors, motion sensors, temperature sensors for every human being on the planet. 26 for every one of you in this room. And there'll be 6 devices, iWatches, iFit devices, magic bands for every human being on the planet. That means connected, that means sentient, that means that if we do this right, and I couldn't agree more with Professor Birch's comment that it has to be about breaking down the stovepipes of governments and working collaboratively between governments, between NGOs, I should say, among governments, NGOs, the private sector, academic institutions, to make this right. Because we actually could get this wrong. With all that connectedness, we could strand people and leave them behind. We could leave them behind. I was part of a discussion of one NGO group in Austin, Texas. We do a lot of work with Austin. And Austin is trying to become smart. And there's a community of stakeholders outside of city government, by the way, that's trying to figure out how to do it. And I stayed in a hotel about 2 miles away from this discussion. And as I made my way from the east side of Austin to the west side, literally across the street, I must have passed 400 people living in the streets, in trucks, etc., because that is the part of Austin that we're not aware of. And the discussion proceeded to talk about the Internet of Things and smart buildings and wayfinding and so on and so forth. And the comment I made is this city will never become smart if there are 400 people living in the streets. The challenge for us is to make sure that it's not a single person living in the streets of Austin. At that point, perhaps you'll be smart. So I think, agree with all the comments that have been made that we have to make sure that these technologies, the magic dust of the IoT, isn't just for the privileged, but it's actually for those that are living at the base of the pyramid. And we're at Accenture committed to that. I know I have a couple minutes left. Let me just say that the challenge for us, and I suspect is the case with many of you in the room, and certainly our partners in the room, on what to do, is now, it shouldn't be what can you do because a vendor came to you or because a technology exists, but what should you do to bring connectivity to the lowest levels of society? What should we do? The technologies exist. And so, everything I didn't learn in kindergarten. I learned it in Psych 101. And there was a gentleman that many of you may be familiar with by the name of Abraham Maslow, who lived across the street in Brooklyn, who came up with a very resilient city of individual human condition and behavior, which is his theory of the hierarchy of needs. Well, what we talk about at Accenture is if you're looking for an organizing principle around connectivity, holistically, a sentient being, meaning a city 30 years out, why don't we borrow from what you learned? Perhaps we ought to structure our projects and our use cases on what collectively that community cares about most. What's the thing that we individually care about the most? It's our safety. I don't particularly care about the connectivity of this building if there's asbestos hanging from the ceiling, or if it's going to take an hour from a first responder to get to me if I happen to fall and break my leg. For me, the very first thing I care about is my individual safety. For cities, collectively, increasingly, what they will care about holistically, given the day and age that we live in, will be their public safety. Once that's set, and by the way, there are projects that you can deliver through either magic dust or IoT that can deliver that safety. That's priority one. After that, you can think about perhaps Abraham's next need, which is nourishment, sustenance. Sustainability is the analog I would argue for this together. But then you can talk about resource efficiency, etc. Once that perhaps is satisfied holistically for the entire community, then you can talk about connectedness. How do I connect this building to that building from a sort of a social connectedness standpoint? And perhaps once that's satisfied, you can reach the highest levels of Abraham talked about, and as we talked about, just self-actualization. It sounds romantic, but it's being done. And does anyone have any ideas as to where it's being done? It's being done in Dubai. Dubai has put itself, it's sort of challenged itself to become the happiest tornado, I'm sorry, city on earth. Happiness equals self-actualization. If you Google Dubai, you will see Abraham Maslow's hierarchy. And that's something that we very proudly brought to the city of Dubai years ago. And that's how they're now pursuing happiness. Now, again, through the magic of IoT. So, anyway, so let me pause there. Of course I have a quote. My quote is Jean-Luc Picard. And Jean-Luc Picard is the captain of the Enterprise. And anytime he asked his first mate or whatever to do something, he would say, make it so. Yeah, it's good.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Salinas, also for reintroducing the Maslowian needs pyramid, which is not necessarily the first concept, but as we saw, could be a very good vehicle for a holistic urban environment of the future and of current times too. But also for highlighting, as other speakers have done too, on the importance of that all stakeholders need to work together to have a really successful future of cities that want to be socially inclusive. Now, last but not least, I will welcome John Farmer to say a few words. He's the Director of Technology and Civic Innovation of the Microsoft Corporation. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs for bringing this together on World Cities Day. Thanks to all of you for coming. And I'll just start by echoing something that's been said before. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment. Our problems and challenges are so complex that they're not going to be solved by any one sector or any one organization. So when I left the White House a few years ago and joined Microsoft, it was because the company cared about taking a collaborative cross-sector approach. It wasn't that it was a global company. That's certainly important, it's got resources. But it was that it had a focus on going local and solving problems at the local level to begin with by working with the nonprofits and foundations, with the universities, with the startups, with local governments, so that we could do more together than any one of us could do apart. Microsoft Cities is the group that I am now part of, that we created. We're active in over a dozen cities. And these cities are really the laboratories for innovation, where we are working to co-design solutions to hard problems, using new technologies, and then thinking about scale after we see success. So the history of smart cities, to echo something that Saul said, I think it's been too much about bits and bytes and not enough about people. The built environment can be connected, but that only matters if it's benefiting people's lives. Our systems and processes can be better and more efficient, but at the end of the day, they only matter, that improvement only matters at least, if they're first humane. So smart city is one that works for everybody. I think we've all agreed on that today. If it excludes people with a certain level of education, it's not really so smart. If it excludes people with cognitive or physical disabilities, it's not so smart. So starting with that agreement that a smart city has to be for everyone. It can't leave people out, it can't leave people behind. We at Microsoft start with the idea of inclusive design. We've heard about universal design today, we think of it as inclusive design. Whenever we're building a new technology, we don't want to think about inclusivity after the fact, we don't want to think about accessibility after the fact. We want to bake that into our design process. And we believe that solving problems in cities should be the same way. It shouldn't be an afterthought or a bolt-on, it needs to be something to start with. And it starts with empathy. That's at the core of inclusive design. And one of the examples that we often give is that inclusive design is good for everybody. That if you imagine a person who has a hand but does not have fingers, and that might be a permanent situation that they're going to have throughout their life, well, that's a permanent disability. But you've also got people who've broken their arms, and they've got temporary disability. You've got a mother trying to watch her kids carrying a couple of bags in her hands. She also then has a situational disability. So when you think about the innovations that we create that make our cities more inclusive, they are not benefiting a small fraction of the population, they're benefiting all of us. And so that's where we start. I'll give you a couple of examples of projects that we've done with this in mind. One of them is Microsoft Translator. Microsoft Translator aims to bring down the language barrier using machine translation. There have been incredible advancements made in just the last couple of years with deep neural networks. The quality of translation technology, if you haven't looked at it recently, go back and take a look, because in the last 2 years it's gotten massively better. And we've worked with local governments to deploy Microsoft Translators, real-time voice-to-voice translation technology. So if you say something in Italian, and I hear it in English, and I respond in English, and you can hear it in Italian. It's got about a 1 second lag, it's over 95% accurate, and it's getting better all the time because there's machine learning underneath the hood. So this is being used in business meetings, it's being used for tourism. We said this needs to be used so that people can get access to government services in the city in which they live. Here in New York City, 49% of the population, of the households, speak a language other than English at home. And that means that some of the people in those households really aren't comfortable speaking English. So we need to make sure that our government services are available in any language that someone speaks, and technology can help us do that. Another example I'll give you is a chatbot that we've developed in Los Angeles to help the government of Los Angeles provide their services using artificial intelligence. And this is a project that we've done in one place, but obviously this is something that's relevant to cities around the United States and around the world. And when you hear about these projects and you hear about the deployment of artificial intelligence, you might think, well, what does that mean for people's jobs? And we're thinking the same way. We're thinking about the fact that the jobs of the past are not necessarily the jobs of the future. And in every city in which we're operating, when we talk to the mayors and the local officials, making sure that their people have the skills that are going to be relevant in the decades to come is at the top of the list. And that's why here in New York City, we've deployed Tech Jobs Academy, a program we co-designed with the City of New York to deliver mid-level technical skills to people who are unemployed or underemployed who generally do not have college degrees. And we saw people go from below the poverty line to middle-class salaries in a matter of months. We are running actually a program in Colorado called Skillful. It's a partnership, again, cross-sector partnership with the Markle Foundation to do similar work. And we have apprenticeship programs here in the United States, in France, in the UK, in Germany, in South Africa, and in more places to do exactly that. So we want to work with local communities to ensure that we're delivering the skills of tomorrow to their populations. And so when we think about artificial intelligence, you hear a lot about Skynet, some scary stories. And the reality is that general artificial intelligence is still a ways away. But specific, specialized artificial intelligence is here today, and we can deploy it for public good. And it's not going to be who has the best algorithms, those you'll be able to buy in the marketplace. Data is important, so making sure that you have data on, for example, traffic fatalities. You need to have data both on the negative outcomes and the positive outcomes so that you can train those algorithms and you can actually get the benefits of being a smart city. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not the algorithms or the data that's going to determine whether something is smart, it's the people. Any community's greatest resources is the people. That was true, it is true, it hasn't changed. And a city needs to ensure that the people have the right skills for the 21st century, needs to ensure that people are future ready. And with that, I can't think of a better quote to wrap up on than to quote Ambassador Minor, quoting William Shakespeare, what is a city but its people?
Thanks very much, Mr. Froum, and also for using very concrete examples that could be used for inclusive smart cities of the future. Hopefully more and more cities will adopt these kind of technologies to bring in more and more people and to bring in more and more social groups. We have now only 15 minutes left, and after having listened to 6 speakers so far, I would be very curious to hear your views and to also hear in the form of some questions for our panelists and for the ambassador as well as the keynote speaker. So I would suggest we start maybe with 2 questions. It should be very crisp and short, and maybe you may wish also to address a specific person, and then we go from there. Please. And please identify yourself.
Thank you. I'm Ignacio Socias from International Federation for Family Development. Well, in fact, my question is for young farmers specifically, but maybe from the family's point of view, there is always, I see, this fear to technology of parents because they feel sometimes they don't cope with what the children are doing. So my question is, what can we do in cities to make parents more comfortable with the technology children are using?
That's a fair question. So how can families be comfortable that their children are safe, to go back to Saul's point. And there are a number of features baked into not just Microsoft technologies, Microsoft Windows Defender, but into many of the technologies that are coming out today. At the end of the day, it does add an additional burden on the parents to make sure that they are up to speed on what those defenses are that exist to help ensure that their children are exposed to what they want them to be exposed to and not to potential negative influences. One thing I'll point out is that if we go back 100 years, a little over 100 years, to when the automobile was a new technology. One of the first things that it was used for was to rob banks and to help people get away and commit crimes. And unfortunately, people with nefarious intent are still using technology to commit crimes and to do bad things. But it's on all of us to ensure that we are keeping up with that, we're ahead of that. And so I can assure you that at Microsoft, we take the potential negative implications of new technologies very seriously, but we want to make sure that the way these technologies are being used, the positive effects far outweigh the negative.
Partner with on autonomous vehicles, driverless vehicles, they're coming, certainly. Huge implications on industries, including the insurance industry, etc. I think the challenge, I think, for cities, at least based on the conversations we're having, is how exactly do you roll them out in a safe manner that makes it sort of that rolls them out in a way that's both safe for those who are in those vehicles as well as those that are driving vehicles around those driverless vehicles. And so what we're seeing is sort of individual efforts to put the infrastructure in place that would limit the exposure of those driverless vehicles to vehicles with drivers in corridors, for example. So in other words, one could envision in Washington, D.C., a corridor between Dulles Airport and Washington, D.C. that will be devoted entirely to driverless vehicles that will shuttle passengers from Dulles Airport to downtown without interference, quote unquote, from other vehicles and vice versa. So I think that's what we are beginning to see as being for perhaps stage one deployment of autonomous vehicles is sort of a protective zone, if you will, around these vehicles in order to sort of provide some comfort and assurance to those that are around that in fact these new technologies are safe and reliable, et cetera, et cetera. They're coming for sure. There's discussions, I think just insult the world. So that's my initial comment on that.
There's a big environmental issue with regard to this. The big question is, will autonomous cars contribute to sprawl, or will they not contribute to sprawl? Will they make cities more efficient? So there's a lot of research that needs to be done about this, and it'll be interesting to see.
So my name is Keith Kirkland, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of WearWorks. And at WearWorks, we build wearable haptic navigation devices for the blind and visually impaired. And so hearing how important inclusive design and accessibility is on this agenda has been like eye-opening for me. One of the questions that I have is, it seems like a lot of government organizations now kind of have this at top of mind. How do companies like mine, where we kind of are stepping into the space of inclusive design, we're actually running a blind marathoner through the New York City Marathon on Sunday. He'll be unguided for the first time ever. And so we're stepping into this space like wholeheartedly that's really, really new. And so we would love to try to understand like how do we connect with government organizations to be able to help them design and deliver better services around inclusive design.
Quick response, if I could, please send me an email. I don't say that lightly. I mean, we spend a lot of time actually incubating and vetting organizations like yours on behalf of our clients on a regular basis. We're doing it as we speak. So we'd love to sort of hear what you do and where you're interested in doing work. But you're right. I mean, I think it's very tempting for at least our clients to go to those brands that they recognize, that are global, that can sort of bring a technology that's been brought forward and worked with bringing it here. It is perhaps less obvious to them that there are unique solutions that can be brought to bear by entrepreneurs like yourself and organizations. So I think we try to vet that on behalf of our clients. Yeah. I suspect Microsoft does the same. In fact, I know Microsoft does the same. So.
And I'd echo that. I'd be happy to speak afterwards and potentially make some introductions to people within the city that we work with who I think would be interested in what you're doing. Yeah. One thing I would point out is that many cities, New York among them, are constrained in terms of what their budgets allow. So I think there'd be a lot better partners in terms of co-designing, giving you access to potential scenarios where you can really get inside and make sure you're designing something that works. I think funding probably likely need to come from somewhere else.
I'd actually point you to an NGO in New York called Transportation Alternatives, which is basically around to provide safer streets, safer shared streets, non-motorized transit infrastructure. And I think they could provide both specific technical advice and give advice on how to engage the city as they've done very well.
I use data every day, and it's more and more. I'd like to know how I can make sure that the data I'm using is qualitative, not only quantitative. And how can I make that happen? I get nervous about the amount of data I get.
Well, it depends on how it's collected. Quantitative data is statistics, numbers. Qualitative is usually more coded words. And so it will be quantitative from the point of view of it being coded, but definitely it comes in the form of words. Does that straighten that out? I mean, I have PhD students who are troubled over this.
It's just that the answers, when we look at quantitative data, and we then try to get an answer, and the answer is used for qualitative purposes, and I'm not sure that they relate to each other well.
You need both.
Improvement.
You need both to give you the sort of universal pattern, but then you need the qualitative data to explain that pattern.
I absolutely echo that. I think, but you sort of getting underneath your question, you're presenting a challenge which I think is going to be a challenge for all of us who analyze data and do analytics, which is increasingly, because of the availability of data at the edge, and to collect that data and have it roll up what we call a solution stack and do analytics on it, it is going to be, again, I'll use the same term, very tempting to just collect quantitative data and then make qualitative assessments from it. And it's happening now in real time, by the way. I think a lot of the apps that you'll begin to see allow the user to just provide input, blah, 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 blah. Here I am, this is what I'm doing, et cetera, et cetera. By definition, that is quantitative data. It doesn't allow me to say, well, I feel this way, or my evaluation of this retail experience is X, Y, Z. I'm just punching numbers in. So I think we may lose that. So I think that it's a valid point. And I think we have to, those of us who are practitioners in this field have to be very guarded about that, because we don't want just to sort of have a set of quantitative data and then make the wrong assumptions about it based on potentially being or thinking it is qualitative. If that makes sense.
And a quick follow-up on that, just to say, nothing replaces talking to actual people. And in our public space work, we make a lot